our sound system we're not having the music that rises as we get ready to introduce our next faculty speaker. Yeah, we can think about that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce David Lobell, who is a professor in the Department of Earth Systems and Science, and who really thinks about global health through a different lens. He spends a lot of time in the Center for Food Security and the Environment, and one of the places that, Gretchen was talking about, what's this relationship between ecosystems, between the environment and health? One of the clear links here is through agriculture. There are lots of different ways that I could introduce David. There are lots of different accolades I could aspire to him, that I could rightly connect with him. However, I want to mention one aspect that's rarely on his CV, and that is that he is both an active basketball player and coach to his children. So we'll see him draw on all of his skills as he talks about the impact of a changing climate on food availability and quality.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So you were promised a dynamic talk in the afternoon on a beautiful day. So I'll try to do that, but more so I'll try to get through this so that we can open up to questions and discussion. I understand that the point of today is to try to connect different people on campus. So just to explain a little bit, I actually didn't put up all my affiliations there, but one of my main affiliations on campus is in the Center on Food Security and Environment, which is a center really concerned about hunger around the world and all the contributing factors to that. And throughout my career, one of the aspects of that I've worked on a bit is the impacts of climate change. So I'll focus a little bit on that today. But let me just say at the outset that we sort of have the conceit in FSE that food security is one of the major underlying, or food insecurity is one of the major underlying risk factors for a lot of health problems around the world. And so when we think about, say, childhood malnutrition, I mean, I don't really know how much to believe the statistics, but we like to believe those statistics that say much more than half of all under 5 deaths are fundamentally a problem of malnutrition. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from here. When we think about the impacts of climate change on health, yes, there are impacts on diseases and vectors and all sorts of things, but if there were to be an impact on malnutrition, then that would probably be number one, or at least among the top 2 or 3 of all the issues around climate change and public health. So I welcome you guys to challenge me on that, because I'm not sure that's true, but that's sort of my assumption going in. All right. I'm assuming this thing in front of me is the thing I need to switch, but I don't actually know. Okay. There was a delay, okay. So this is just starting with a summary figure from a chapter that I was involved with in the IPCC, which is, maybe you guys know, is the climate change report that comes out every so often. And we were tasked with trying to say, what do we understand about the impacts of climate change on food security? And this is just, if you work backwards from the right to the left, you can see that food security, which we define as having access to food, having enough food available, being able to utilize that food in terms of your disease burdens and the nutritional composition of the food, and all of that getting to the point where you have enough food to live a healthy life. And healthy is defined typically as something like a sedentary life, enough to maintain basic metabolism and not much more. And we understand lots of factors affect that, and there's only a few pathways that we really understand well. And in particular, when we think about climate change, the only real pathways that we understand well, which I'll talk about today, are the pathways of climate affecting crops, those crops either changing in terms of quantity or quality and affecting food security. But it's important to realize that there are all sorts of other pathways of influence on food security, including, not least of which is the effects on people's incomes, whether there's evidence that, say, conflicts become more common in climate change, or just economic activity overall becomes less productive. And those things could certainly indirectly affect food security. And the width of those bars is intended to show how much we actually understand in terms of the literature. But this is in terms of the quantity of crops, and so I'll just take a little bit of time on this to give you the overall picture of what we as a community feel are the impacts of climate change on the quantity of, or the productivity of crops in terms of the quantity produced per unit of land. And this shows you a summary of all the studies that have been done with some quantitative projections for whatever region, whatever crop, as a function of the time that we're looking at. And what you see here is the blue bar showing you where we expect some moderate or substantial benefit from climate change. And this is typically due to the fact that you're in a cold area that's warming, and so you're becoming more optimum for crop production, or the CO2 benefits, the increase of CO2, which has direct benefits on the plants physiologically, is outweighing any negative effects of the climate changes. In the reddish or orangish bars are those places that are losing, and these are typically because those benefits of CO2 and maybe warming are completely outweighed by harm from warming, and there's all sorts of physiological reasons that warming is bad for crops, just like there's reasons it's bad for many humans. What you should notice on this is how, as you go out in time, the preponderance of studies show negative impacts, and those impacts get quite severely negative by the middle and end of the century, where up to half of the studies are showing losses of 10% or more in terms of productivity. And this is including, again, this is net of the positive and negative effects. So these kind of impacts could have substantial effects on the prices of these foods, the availability of them, and then food security, although we don't actually understand quantitatively the actual impacts that are likely to happen on food security. They're in the ballpark of tens to hundreds of millions of people potentially at risk of falling into this food insecure category. I wanted to point out that even though I think historically we focused a lot on this quantity effect, and in particular on crops, that right now in terms of active research, and this might be an area that is of interest to those thinking about what are the connections to active researchers, a lot of the work is going on in looking at impacts beyond crops and impacts beyond quantities. And so one aspect of that is beyond crops, and this is, I think, a nice example, which maybe it's too late in the day to really explain this in full, but this is showing you for the US, one of the first studies to look at total factor productivity in agriculture as a whole. So this includes crops and livestock and all sorts of other agricultural activities, livestock being nearly half of the value of agricultural output in this country. And what it shows you is for this national total factor productivity, the correlations with different outcomes in terms of weather in different parts of the country. And you see these dark blue spots, which are, this is a bit switch color from what we often use as red as like the negatives. But here, blue is showing you a negative effect of high temperature on total factor productivity. And you can see the summer in the Midwest is hugely important for total factor productivity, but also things like the spring weather in the West and the Southwest, both in terms of rainfall and temperatures, and then the autumn temperatures in the West actually being quite important. We have a lot of high-value crops here, and it appears that warm falls are not very good for the value of production, whether that's because of pests building up or melting of water resources, et cetera. So this just gives you a sense, and these impacts are not small. Like, this is a recent study. This is not a study I've done, but this is an interesting study, I think, to show you the other dimensions that are in play. Because if you look around the world, obviously crops are only part of the aspects of agricultural productivity. You have labor productivity, you have livestock productivity, et cetera. And what this shows you is in the US itself, and US is a big driver of global prices as well, the effects we expect in terms of total factor productivity are such that another 40 years of climate change, or actually 30 years of climate change, would be equivalent to all of the technological progress we've made since about 1980. So the feeling is that right now, we're at a point where technological progress is net positive in terms of overcoming climate change impacts, but that is expected to be hard to maintain. So these are not small effects by any means. Now, the main thing I wanted to talk about today in the time I have is on the nutritional quality side. And I think I don't have to explain to you why food security should be much more than just about calories and even protein, but understanding micronutrient deficiencies around the world, which are more prevalent than food insecurity in the calorie sense. This shows you a meta-analysis of a bunch of experiments that were done on various crops. So this shows you C3 grasses like wheat and rice, and then you have crops like peas and soybeans, and then C4 grasses like maize and sorghum, all of these important in various poor parts of the world. And the evidence is pretty consistent, except maybe in C4 plants, that as you raise CO2, which is what we're doing with climate change, you dilute the concentration of these important micronutrients. You also tend to dilute some of the concentrations of like the anti-nutrients, like phytates, that are not very healthy. But in net, the bioavailability of these things is expected to go down. And the reasons for that are somewhat, multifaceted. One of them is that with higher CO2, plants actually transpire more slowly. They're more efficient in using water, but that means that they have less nutrients being brought up into the plant. It also is the fact that just in terms of stoichiometry, they're able to, they shift their ratios to have more carbohydrate per unit of micronutrients. Now, one interesting thing that's been done recently, and this is a good example, I think, of a connection across campus, is that Sanjay Basu and his student, Chris Wyant, approached us wanting to know how big are these effects and are they going to be important enough to matter in terms of disease burdens around the world or micronutrient deficiencies and what they mean for actual livelihoods. So Sanjay and his group have great microsimulation models of looking at how different deficiencies propagate into disease outcomes and how the demographics of the population affect that. And so what they did was they took these kind of impacts and they fed them into their microsimulation models and looked at what kind of disease burdens would be expected to occur in these units of dailies, which are new to me, I'm sure not new to any of you. Why an acronym means a loss of life but doesn't have loss in the title, I've never figured out. But we were looking at the dailies that were attributable to these micronutrient deficiencies, and then looking at the, so this gives you a sense of that. These are the per capita burden of disease, additional disease burden, in terms of just the zinc and iron deficiencies that would be induced by these climate changes, the CO2 and climate changes. And you can see that they're on the order of years in terms of, this is showing log dailies per 1,000 people. So I don't know exactly what the units are. You'd have to be maybe these are familiar to the dailies folks. But what was more interesting to me was just the total numbers of, tens of millions of more deficient people. And then what we did was we looked at how does climate mitigation as a strategy, so which would potentially mitigate this amount of impact, how does that compare to other types of health interventions? Because often what you get in the climate change world is you'll say people will say, yes, climate change is bad, but the things we need to do for climate change are just development, the same type of typical health improvements or economic improvements that we need anyway. And once we get those right, the impacts of climate change will fade away because our societies, as they get healthier, they get less sensitive to these types of things. And there's some truth in that, right? Like as you get air conditioning, maybe you're less concerned about, and for that matter, screen doors and screens on your windows, maybe you're less concerned about the vectors that are becoming more prevalent with climate change. So there certainly are interactions. But the point here was to look quantitatively at, well, how do these types of more traditional interventions compare to, say, reducing the amount of climate change? So then they ran their microsimulation models for all sorts of different interventions, as well as climate mitigation strategies, and that's what's shown here. This is really the last slide I have, which is on the left is showing you the benefit of doing something like achieving the Paris Accords. If you guys remember a long time ago when Obama was president and we had this real feel-good moment of working with other countries and setting some agenda for meeting a certain target. And in that case, the target was something about 2 degrees above pre-industrial. So the idea was how much benefit will we get in terms of disease burden if we met that target versus if we went on sort of business as usual. And that's shown on the left here in terms of the percent reduction of the millions of people that would be affected by these zinc and iron deficiencies. And then what you see on the right, and this really surprised me because I'm not so familiar with the health literature, but I thought that health interventions were actually much more effective than they really are. And I kept asking, are you sure these are right? But my understanding from them is that these health interventions are often very targeted. They don't reach the full population. And so you do help a subset of the population, but something like climate change is diluting crops for everyone and everywhere. And so you get much less actual return or I should say that these types of interventions, whether you're looking at within just Africa in the red or the other, or on average across the world in blue, you get some benefit, but even those added together are not able to compensate for the amount of climate change impact that you have. So this is consistent with what I was mentioning before, just about total factor productivity is yes, we can still do things to help, but climate change is meaning that we have to run that much faster to keep up in terms of these types of productivity burdens or health burdens. So, if you're going to take away anything from this talk on this fine afternoon, there are big yield impacts, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time working on in the past, and certainly I think in terms of global health impacts of climate change, we don't have to overcomplicate things. Like, those are going to be hugely important, especially I think in South Asia, where the impacts of climate change are going to be probably the most dramatic, at least in the near term, and there are already so many millions of people at risk of hunger. You could probably add sub-Saharan Africa to that and not get many arguments from anyone. But in terms of food security, I think we're increasingly trying to think more broadly about other aspects of food security. So certainly the disease burdens that people have and their ability to absorb nutrients is important. The micronutrient levels and the potential ramifications and all sorts of aspects of cognitive development and nutrition are important. So we're just starting to understand that climate is also affecting those, and we don't really know how to, say, compare the yield effects to those yet, but we're starting to do that. And then the last point was really about, I guess, the multiple pathways that we have to begin to understand. And we actually, we're just starting to understand how big these multiple pathways might be before and then we need to get to understanding how the different adaptation strategies might complement each other or compete with each other, and what the net benefits could be. So there's all sorts of, I think, interesting areas to get into if you're worried about the disease, the health burden of climate change. Of course, there are plenty of things independent of food security, but I think a lot of them intersect food security. And at FSC, we are pretty small. I mean, I wouldn't say we are actively looking for tons and tons of new collaboration just because we don't like to take on things we're not going to fulfill. But there is a lot of opportunity here, and I think there's a lot of great, ideas around campus about how to make progress on these. So I guess I'll open it up for 10 minutes of questions. Thank you. Yeah.
That was a great presentation. Thank you so much for pointing it out from a different perspective. So I'm Bonnie Maldonado. I'm a pediatric infectious disease doctor here. So I was curious to see that last slide, and maybe I didn't really understand it very well because I'm not a, this one. So when you look at the right end of that, it's interesting that the mitigation for some of the infectious diseases is not there, but for pneumonia, it appears that it's a little bit better than others. And do you think you can explain, I think you kind of touched on that, you didn't understand why that would be as well, but I'm wondering why there's even a differential between those diseases.
I think that the way they pursued each of these strategies is they followed some, like, what is the existing proposals out there for a large-scale investment in reducing these particular type of events. And my understanding is that, and all within the context of what zinc and iron deficiency would be doing to these kind of disease burdens. So zinc and iron deficiency, the main things they affect are respiratory, and you know this better than I do.
So that's what I thought, right. So you think it has to do with the impact of, so they're kind of covariates in a way.
Right.
So some of the micronutrient deficiencies may impact some disease, but not others.
Right.
I see.
Right.
Okay. And did they do, with some of the previous work on mitigation, was there a sensitivity analysis as well looking at, so for example, we're not going to do everything, and some places will do more than others. So can you create a tool, or is there a tool created where you can look at that sliding scale? For example, like if 50% of a mitigation is done in a particular climate, would that be able to be measured some way?
In terms of climate mitigation? Or?
In terms of like impact over long periods.
Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of studies that break down by climate scenario what would happen to, say, yields, and look at the benefits of following one trajectory versus another, and at a crop-specific level or a region-specific level. And the general picture that emerges there is that at a global scale, the worst impacts are felt in the hottest areas because they're already sort of at the edge of where most of the major crops that we grow are comfortable. And so any sort of mitigation scenario disproportionately benefits those areas, or any additional climate change disproportionately hurts those areas. And then on a crop-specific basis, generally speaking, wheat and corn-based systems or regions that really depend a lot on wheat and corn are disproportionately hurt from climate change compared to like rice-based cultures or I mean, most of the world is either rice, wheat, or corn-based in terms of their main diets. But that's been done. Certainly, there's a lot of understanding of the difference between, let's say, a high-emission scenario and a low-emission scenario.
Yeah, and I have one last question is, did they also, in looking at the impacts on yield, what the impact of insect propagation would be in these areas as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, which I kind of glossed over, is there are tons of factors that are kind of the known unknowns that aren't really well modeled. And in some cases, because a lot of these techniques are based on looking at historical variations or historical gradients in climate and productivities, is we don't actually know how much of certain things are incorporated or not incorporated. But what we do see with pests and diseases in particular is they're definitely not in most of these projections because we know the models don't have them. And yet we do see both anecdotally and also in a lot of, for countries that do record data on where diseases are occurring and where and how much farmers are using pest control measures, we do see those responding to climate change in a way that's, concerning. And so in many ways, the downside risks are not fully captured in those types of projections. Yeah, sure.
Nick Kutchers, I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, and so the carbohydrate mention earlier caught my attention. So, and I'm not familiar with this research, are the composition of percentage of carbohydrates or percent of fiber of carbohydrates, is climate change playing any role in that, making them higher in carbohydrate content, or the composition at all?
Yeah, I mean, generally what happens to a lot of these crops is their carbon to whatever ratios go up. So there tend to be more carbohydrate rich relative to proteins or relative to these micronutrients.
But like of the particular food itself, is it going to change, evolve over time to have more, a different percentage, or not so much?
Percentage of carbohydrates or percentage of like fiber?
Carbs and fiber.
I don't know if the aggregate percentage changes in those things are significant. Okay. I don't know if that's been looked at exactly. Yeah, I think one of the bigger issues in terms of diet is as these yield effects play out, they propagate into price effects, and those propagate into dietary choices. And so what you'll see is people changing the composition of what they eat, maybe to adjust to those relative shocks. And that would probably affect it may affect the micronutrients, but it certainly will affect the sort of amount of carbohydrates or starchy staples versus other things, as much or more than the direct effects on the crops themselves.
Hi, David. Did you disaggregate any of your data to look at climate mitigation in urban versus rural? Or for instance, zinc supplementation is going to be very different in children versus adults.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you looked at any gender disaggregation with mitigation strategies.
Yeah, in terms of the health interventions, I don't believe there was any gender differentiation in this. And my understanding I think it was targeted towards children. I think a lot of these proposed interventions are targeted towards children. So these are just details I'm not remembering about these particular intervention strategies. But presumably with these simulation models, it's easy enough to run different types of scenarios and see how effective they are.
David, one of the themes that we've been talking some about today is how do we put our complicated models and evidence into a form that's actionable for decision makers, and particularly decision makers having to make long-term investments to improve the environment. So I'm interested in your perception on how well either this particular work specifically or more generally the argument on the coupling of agricultural productivity to environmental damage has been as an ability to influence policymakers in perhaps outside of this country in terms of taking a constructive approach for a human future.
Okay, well, there's a couple aspects to that in the sense I've thought about it in the context of climate change in particular because I've been involved with things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And not only in this country has it become very political, but I think globally it's become a very political topic where certain countries that view themselves as the potential recipients of a lot of adaptation assistance or clean development mechanism or whatever it is, the funding mechanism to sort of compensate the losers, are very eager and quick to pick up on anything that suggests some negative impacts. And one of the interesting experiences in the IPCC was that like a lot of synthetic organizations that are trying to come up with some summary statements, we rely on the literature. And the literature is often worst in the places that have the poorest data with the poorest populations. And there was a big actual kind of argument that broke out that really stopped progress for a little while of the African countries really being adamant that the whole section that was dealing with like impacts already occurring from climate change were leaving out almost all of the things that they knew were happening in their country. And we would say, well, the literature just doesn't support that. And we had to come up with some language to make it clear that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, et cetera. So I think in many settings, there are policymakers eager to see the message that they want to see. And if science delivers that, they pick it up and run with it. On the sort of just the intersection between the environment and agriculture in general, and sort of all the negative externalities that potentially exist for health or the environment of agricultural activities. I think there it's been a little bit less politicized. I mean, obviously, locally it can often become very political, like when there's local economies that are relying on, say, both agriculture and then there's a separate economy relying on tourism, et cetera. But I think there has been more room there for academics to point out like sort of unexpected or inadvertent types of connections that really raise serious questions by policymakers and have them appreciate, in many cases, like the trade-offs. But I can't claim to have seen a strategy that's particularly effective or a level of sort of sophistication that's the right level of nuance. So certainly in the climate change experience, like nuance is really hard to get across. And like everybody in the world, I guess, but especially policymakers, they're really good at hearing what they want to hear and trying to use things to the purposes they already had. But I guess the way I think about it is that there's different timescales of these things. So in all of my interpersonal interactions, it's kind of transactional in terms of they want to get something out of it in the short term. But in the long term, it's the knowledge and the science that drives the agenda. And so I sort of try to keep my mind on that as opposed to spending all my time trying to influence current decisions. Maybe that's just a convenient philosophy that I don't want to be flying around the world and interacting with policymakers all day.
Sana, quick question.
Just some days.
Okay, thanks. Sana Sokolo, work for the Woods Institute as a senior scientist and fellow at the CIGH. And my question is, as the crops change on land and climate change affects that, there's some hope that there's going to be an aquaculture sector that can fill some of the gaps and be a mitigation strategy. So just wondering your opinion on that in terms of protein replacement, but also these micronutrients and things you guys are looking at.
Yeah. I mean, aquaculture is a great example of where like something that's quickly changing, and maybe on the surface, it's got all sorts of risks, but on the other hand, it's helping to supply a need out there that might be much more it might be doing that in a much more environmentally and health-friendly way than some of the other possible ways of meeting those needs. So, I mean, for those who don't know, fish farming now is like half of all fish that's consumed in the world, and it's quickly growing, so it'll soon be, the majority of it. And environmentally, it's, at least in terms of a calorie and protein production system, it's quite efficient. It's like on par with the best of the land animal systems we have. If Roz Naylor were here, she's the director of FSC, she would be able to tell you in more detail all of the health risks and environmental risks associated with fish farming, because there are plenty. But I think like the broad picture, I think it is quite an effective tool in looking forward and meeting needs, and also in terms of adapting to climate change, because when you have the ability to sort of quickly change, I mean, I don't know how quickly it is, but you have your ability to sort of restock with different varieties, and it's a lot like annual agriculture, where there is more adaptation potential than maybe some of the land systems that we're sort of wedded to. So I guess overall, I view it as a pretty important part of the system, but it's the kind of thing where if you don't, the more you know about it, you probably become less enamored with it. So certainly there's a lot of chemicals in fish farming that are of concern, just like with agriculture on land.
Thank you very much, David.
Sure.